I put my name and phone number and email address at the top, is so that if you have any just desire for further dialogue about anything I bring up, or I have a list of a lot of references that I haven't given you, so I'd be happy to supply those to you, or just anybody who wants to keep an ongoing conversation about what we're talking about today. That's my contact information. So I'm going to be talking about the psychological impacts of climate change, and also the psychological factors that come into engagement about climate change. So the first thing I'll be referencing is the American Psychological Association, a report. This was done in 2014, and it's called Beyond Storms and Droughts. And this looks at the psychological impacts of climate change. And as you can well imagine, when there's a severe weather event, along with everything else, there's huge psychological impacts. Stress, PTSD, anxiety, depression, there's an increase in violence, there's an impact to family relationships. There's one of the references that I would give you is a psychiatrist by the name of Lisa Van Susteren, and you can go on YouTube and watch her, but she is a psychiatrist who's really trying to lobby or to speak to the whole psychology community about how unprepared we are to deal with the influx of problems that there's going to be happening as a result of climate change. So that's really, really important. I really encourage you, if you get a chance, to look at her talks on YouTube.
And how do you spell her last name?
It's if you Google her on YouTube, you'll get a lot of Greta Van Susteren. You know, the Fox News person or whoever she is, but it's the same. Lisa, L-I-S-E, and then it's V-A-N-S-U-S-T-E-R-A-N. And I really, I'll say a little bit at the end about some other things I really like about her, but she's very good. And then we'll be talking about two other books. One is called Engaging with Climate Change. And let me back up just a minute. The APA report is going into the effects of severe weather events, the psychological effects of severe weather events. And let me just say as an aside that there's been recent research that for every 1 degree increase in temperature and in every 1 inch rainfall above the normal, there is a correlated statistic that has to do with increase in domestic violence, child abuse, community violence. So heat itself is really, really a stressor. And also just the changing nature of things is just really a stressor for people. But the other thing we want to look at is climate change affecting us psychologically now, even outside of severe weather events? So to talk about that, I looked at two other books, Engaging with Climate Change, and you have it there, and also Environmental Melancholy by Renee Lertzman. And they both look at it from what I call a depth psychology point of view. And I'll say a little bit more about what that point of view means. Now this Engaging with Climate Change with the editor Sally Weintraub, they're in the UK. And apparently there's a lot more going on, you know, kind of the whole psychology field about climate change in the UK, what you're seeing here. But it's a collection, because she's an editor, it's a collection of a lot of people, psychologists, sociologists, scientists, all contributing about this issue of engaging with climate change. So, is it affecting us now? And when we go to engage, who are we talking to? Who are we? Who is doing the talking? And so to think about that, we have to think about how we look at the human mind. Now normally, and this is the way polls are, polls that gather statistics about climate change make some assumptions. They make an assumption that a person is unitary. Well, that's not really true. We change from moment to moment. In psychology, we like to say we have a number of selves, but also we have a lot of capability to feel ambivalent about things. For example, and it's a very good example, you can feel strongly about climate change, but you can also be worried about your job. So you have two different feelings, and they're kind of contrary to each other. But you can have both feelings. You can also be worried about climate change, but also like very much some of the things that technology has brought us, and like this lifestyle, and be very identified with this lifestyle. So it can be very ambivalent. Polls tend to look at people as demographics. And they tend to think we ask them this question and this is where they stand. And maybe they'd still always answer the same thing on a poll, but in their actual life, which we're looking at what's called psychic reality, they're all over the place. So they look at things as a demographic. You're from this area, you're male, you're female, and you can make assumptions about that based on the demographic. But in actuality, we're all very idiosyncratic. We're all very, very different. We're very unique. We all have stories. We're all part of a narrative. And so one of the things I brought when I did this presentation at CCL is what brings us to this table? What brings us here? It's probably going to be idiosyncratic reasons. And as I mentioned there, one of the things that I think impacts me is that I grew up with a mother who had cancer. And so because of that, I think I just feel very emotionally the degradation of Mother Earth. I think I really link those two things in my mind. And so some of the idiosyncratic factors will be how close you've been to nature, and just different factors in your development will make a difference on your day-to-day engagement with climate change. Now, we assume that people are rational. And maybe if you fed all of the information about climate change into a computer, maybe the computer would do the right thing. Who knows? But we are not rational. We are emotional, and we have lots and lots of feelings. And I've listed the feelings there that are involved, and they very, very much influence how we think about things. Now, they're really important, and people probably aren't real aware of their anger, but they can feel a lot of anger at the system for letting this happen. They can feel a lot of anger because they don't feel taken care of. There's a lot of fear. I'll come back to anxiety. One of the ones I really want to focus in on is grief. There is a lot of grief, and I've listed if you really think about it and you really go through the grieving process, then what that involves is acknowledging that we're looking at a possible loss of the earth, especially as a dependable bedrock that supports our life, a loss of the future, a loss of a notion of ourself, and it can also be a loss of the notion of ourself as a good person, and a loss of identity, a loss of lifestyle, a loss of idealizations, a loss of adequacy of leadership. One of the things, and I'm trying to write an article for the psychotherapy journals, one of the things I really want to encourage people in my field to do is to re-examine how they're defining sanity and mental health. Because it's very much defined in terms of our culture and in terms of, fulfillment in our culture. Well, that's part of the problem. So, there's a lot of grief and a lot of need for redefinition of ourselves. We think of the mind as, and I'll come back, let me go through the did not feel anxiety. Let me go through anxiety. Anxiety in depth psychology, and the difference between depth psychology and other forms of psychology is that the depth psychology recognizes the existence of the unconscious mind. So what happens is when you have anxiety that's overwhelming, when there is overwhelming anxiety, then unconscious mechanisms take over. Now, an unconscious mechanism, I mean, if we wanted to give a very stark example, and that's for our own good oftentimes. A very stark example, you take the example of a woman being raped. She's going to go up to the ceiling. She's going to dissociate. She's going to get away from there, and she's probably not going to remember it, or maybe we would hope she doesn't remember it. And that saves her life. That really, so these unconscious mechanisms, most of the time really help us, but they can also be much to our detriment. And when anxiety, and that's the main one, and any other heavy emotion, like very much grief, a lot of guilt, will be registered as anxiety. The anxiety will feel overwhelming, and then these unconscious mechanisms will take over. Now, you know, we could say how much is conscious, how much is unconscious, and climate change denial, how much is rationalization, but I think at least some level of it is unconscious. So that moves us down to conscious and unconscious. The unconscious mechanisms I've listed there are splitting, projection, idealization, and denial. Now, splitting, a good example of splitting is if you have a television evangelist who also is into porn drugs, and I mean, that's a person who has been able to split two parts of their personality so far apart that it's almost like they're a multiple personality disorder. But all of us can do splitting, and splitting is involved in some of the other unconscious mechanisms that take place. Projection is where I say, well, it's China's fault, they're the bad people, but we also can do unconscious projection, which is where I'm not even aware that I'm doing that. I'm just saying they're bad and I have no other frame of reference. Idealization, I think you're seeing a lot of idealizing that's going on around Donald Trump. A lot of idealization idealization can kind of lead to magical thinking, where we think there's going to be an easy solution, or somebody's going to wave a magic wand and get us out of this. But then denial. And of course, you're probably familiar with denial as it relates to terminal illnesses. There's always a lot of denial when it relates to mortality, vulnerability, and dependence. And so that comes in there, and none of us like to acknowledge our vulnerability and dependence. And also our mortality. I mean, climate change brings in all those things. Now, when they talk about denial with regard to grief processes, it can be just a stage. But it also can be far more than a stage. It can be a very entrenched defensive structure. And that's when it's a lot more problem. It's a problem in that way because it's like the more denial that's done on the conscious level, the more anxiety there is on the unconscious level, the more there's a need to deny on the conscious level, and it's a feedback loop. And so that's the example I would give of that is the guy going through a midlife crisis whose parents die and his hair gets thin, but he goes out and buys a convertible and and starts going with a 20-year-old. I mean, that's kind of where we are in our culture, where we're buying the SUVs, you know, we're using, I would say that since Inconvenient Truth came out per capita, we probably burned more cars than we did at that time. And then the other assumption is that we're constant, but we actually are very moment to moment. It's called the state-related nature of the brain. And an example I give of that is there's a marital therapist who has people wear a watch with a thing that takes their pulse. And when their pulse gets up to a certain level, he stops. You can't do the therapy anymore because the brain is not able to process at that level of escalation. And so we are very state-related. We're changing from moment to moment. And we're also, but the good part about it is that we're also developmental. In depth psychology, there is the assumption that people want to develop. They're programmed to develop. Now, I just will go into a little bit about the developmental piece. Depth psychology conceptualizes that as going from omnipotence to reparation. And they use the model of early infant life to conceptualize that. Now, it may not seem all that relevant, but the reason they use it is because of Bergson therapy. And also, I find it very apropos. When you're a young baby, you assume that your mother is there for your benefit. She's there to feed you and take away your waste. And no muss, no fuss, she is there for you. She is, and you're omnipotent, no problems, just, it's like being in the moon. But in the course of development, through the frustration of that, a child eventually gets to where they see the mother as a separate person. A person they can affect, a person they can harm, a person they have to relate to. And that's called reparation. Now, that is kind of how we see the earth oftentimes. It's just supposed to be this thing that we have no effect on by our actions. And so, and one of the things about this developmental arc is in our moment-to-moment psyches, we can be at a pretty good, mature place, and then if we're stressed, we can go right back into omnipotence. You know, I can be this very enlightened person, but don't get my order wrong at the restaurant. I can be the other American. So it's a very, and one of the things that's talked about in the environmental movement, or in the things that I've been reading, is that it's very painful oftentimes for people to come to this place of reparation. Because there's a lot of guilt, because they can see the impact of their actions on the environment. And that's a very tough place. It's a it's people who've done grieving work, really see the effects of their actions, and you can almost get bogged down in that stage. And so one of the important things is to realize, one of the important things is to be able to take action that is felt to mean something, but another is the proportionality of guilt. To realize we have guilt as individuals, but there are also systems that are guilty, and our culture that's guilty. So we do what we can. Now, of course, I've talked about the psychological, there's also cultural, social, all kinds of factors that are involved here. One of the things I liked about the Engaging with Climate Change book was that they brought a lot of disciplines together, and I think we're going to need to do that more and more. I wanted just to say just a word about the Environmental Melancholia book. I don't recommend it necessarily. She's dealing with the problem of polluted waters in the Great Lakes more than climate change. But her method was wonderful. Rather than doing polls, she interviewed people and had long conversations with them. And I would suspect that as a result of just asking people and dialoguing with people, if you ask them a year or two later, they may have even been involved without even, just because their feelings were supported, they were asked what they felt about things, and also, of course, she was a skilled interviewer, but I think that it really stirred them up enough to really create just the seeds of change. In engagement tips, one of the things I think we don't do is oftentimes we just put the information out there without acknowledging the emotional impact it has on people. And somehow people need to, if you bring up the fact, in my last letter to the Congress, I said, I feel anxious. I'm trying to use emotion words whenever I'm dealing with these things. But I think if you say those words when you're making a presentation, then people will feel more supported in the feelings that they're having all by themselves, which I think is really important. But also, bear in mind that people are developmental. And so somewhere there is a care that they have. And so if we assume that they're just, they're a block of wood or whatever, then they're going to be that way. But if we assume that somewhere in there is a developmental spark that we can reach, then I think we're better off. Also, I really suggest what I call congruence, and that means that you model that you've dealt with the emotional difficulties yourself. It's easy to be in climate change denial even as an activist. A way to be in climate change denial is if you relate intellectually to information but not emotionally. And another way to be in climate change denial, I think, is if you don't relate it to other issues. It needs to be related to all the social justice issues. And then I think there's a need to be realistic, not to have easy solutions, but to balance between overwhelm and magical thinking. You don't want to overwhelm, but you don't want to have people think magically. And then one thing I can't stress enough is this is hard work. And we need to take care of ourselves. We need to keep our grief proportional. We need to have balanced lives. It is difficult to be out of the mainstream, and we need to ground ourselves in our intention. So, closing, I'll just say that our capacity to address the problems in our outer reality may have something to do with our being able to address our inner reality. And that our climate and our planet may depend on our ability to maintain hope.
Thank you, Nancy. I really do want to get very quickly with mine because it will take a long time, but I think people might need to respond to this. Is there some short responses that people have to Nancy's presentation? I would just like to say that I love that you talk about the developmental aspects, especially considering how long it has taken me. I'm 69 years old,
yeah.
and it took me to age 60 before I even understood that dialogue was better than firebrand activism.
Yeah.
It takes a long time.
Yeah, it does take a long time. Yeah.
One thing that comes to mind for me is that by approaching it from all of these various psychological elements, it's almost as though some of us who are obsessed by the topic need group therapy.
Yeah, I think so. I think so.
Because individually, we get into our own loop.
Yeah. Yeah, there is a website, and I can send that to you, that it's called Climate Communications. And it's Climate Communications. And it's kind of an online group dialogue about climate change. And yeah, I totally agree that when we're kind of obsessed. Oh, last one thing I wanted to bring up, just I'll add this quickly, is the developmental aspect, as Shelley said. One of the other idiosyncratic things about me is that I'm a recovering alcoholic. And so I think I bring that to climate change too, and to this, because I know that people can change. I do know that people can change, and also that's what therapy is about helping people to make the changes they need to make.
I enjoy so much your term obsessed with. I really feel that way, to the point that when I'm with friends that are supposedly in a very deep relationship with life and they don't read about climate change, I'm thinking, do I need these friends in my life? And I'm thinking, no, I can't think that way.
No.
These are my friends.
Yeah.
I have been shutting down.
Mm-hmm.
I
And
think
it's-
that's an important point.
It's very frightening.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and people can feel so alone. You can feel
Yep.
so alone, and that's never good, that isolation, so.
Well, that's one of the reasons we're together, because we understand it in a
Yeah.
sense that a lot of others don't.
Well, that's a particularly good segue into this book about should we be talking to other people, because he understands our climate change so well, and as Gladys said earlier, with some distress. He recognizes just how dangerous the situation is. But he spent a long time talking to tea partiers and deniers to try to find out why they think the way they do, why they're able to ignore the science, and wrote a book about it. And he actually learned a great deal about them, and he makes a point about what he learned from these people, and found that actually people who are really obsessed about action for climate change are using some of the same psychological mechanisms as the people who are obsessed with against climate change. There's a lot in the book. I found it particularly valuable for me. I said, why did I have to read this book? One of them was, why am I doing this?
Mm-hmm.
And one of the things he said was guilt. You know, because we are all implicated in this. You know, I mean, I not only fly airplanes, I order pieces from China to sell, I heat my house, I am implicated. We are all implicated, and so how do I deal with it?